National Alliance on Mental Illness of Santa Cruz County. And I've been doing this for about 8 years, and I absolutely love NAMI and all of the wonderful people that are part of it. And I want to thank everybody who helped us with our huge fundraising effort this year in the human race. Guess how much we raised? We hit our goal of $25,000. Elena?
We're up to 27.
We're up to 27,000. So that's really good news. We need that support. We need to continue to grow stronger. So tonight is a really special night. We're really happy to have a great author. But for some of you who may not know even anything about what NAMI is, let me give you just a brief overview. What we do is we provide education and support for families affected by mental illness. NAMI also is an advocate. We advocate for improvements in all the resources that can help people with these challenges. And that includes legislative change and system change. How is this? Is this helpful? Okay. And the needs, as you know, are huge. The options for help are limited. Mental health systems are stretched thin and they are underfunded. The criminal justice system is not the right place for our loved ones to end up. And solutions are needed across the nation and in Santa Cruz County. I'm really pleased that DJ Jaffe is visiting California. And while he's in California, we got him to come all the way to Santa Cruz too. He lives in New York, in Harlem, New York. And DJ is really a passionate advocate for reforms of the mental health system. He's the executive director of Mental Illness Policy Organization, a nonpartisan think tank that creates detailed policy analyses for legislators, for the media, and for advocates. He's connected to the Treatment Advocacy Center, and he's also connected to NAMI, and he's running for the NAMI National Board next year. I found that his book was an amazing compilation of facts and stories, history, explanations, some of his outraged opinions, and his recommendations. He's done a tremendous amount of research. And I found his opinions to be really very thought-provoking, maybe they're controversial, as he weighs in on the diversion of funds away from the most seriously mentally ill and the loss of institutional care that we have experienced across the country. After DJ is finished, we'll hear a bit from Michael Fitzgerald, our local NAMI member and advocate. He's the executive director at the Behavioral Health Facility at El Camino Hospital, and he's done some educating to our audience previously. He'll comment on Jaffe's remarks and expand on our local situation and things we're doing locally. So I feel that not just us, but the whole public and the nation needs to become very educated about these issues if we're ever going to see change. I see that the public is generally confused by why things are the way they are, and it's up to us, we who live with experiences. It's up to us to learn and to develop together clear, unified messaging that legislators can act upon. So we at NAMI Santa Cruz want to explore together, learn together, and be open to all opinions and solutions, and provide educational opportunities of all types. So I hope you'll please join me in welcoming Mr. DJ Jaffe.
Can everyone hear me if I talk like this without the microphone? Yes, you can? Okay. You wish you couldn't later. But let me put this feel a little like Sean Spicer on Saturday Night Live. Yell at everybody here. So, I thank you for coming. It's really kind of neat that, like my wife says, why does anybody want to listen to you? But for some reason, I guess it's because you don't know me that you will. But I once went on a job interview, and they asked me what my best quality is for the interview. And so, I made some stuff up and, told them, well, how wonderful I am at this, that, and the other thing. But they also said, well, what's your worst quality? And when they asked me what my worst quality is, I said, well, when someone asks me my opinion, I assume that they want it. And obviously in business, that's not true. They want to hear how great they are. So I think I'm probably about to make the same mistake. I am going to give you my opinion. Now, most people will apologize if they've offended anyone at the end of their speech, but I'm pretty sure I'm going to offend someone, so I'm going to apologize now. I don't expect everyone to agree with what I'm saying. I do think that what I will provide is a new way to look at the problem, and that you will agree with at least some of the things I'm going to talk about. Now, the book is called Insane Consequences: How the Mental Health Industry Fails the Mentally Ill. The insane consequences are that in spite of spending $200 billion in both federal and state funds, we have 140,000 seriously mentally ill who are homeless. We have 392,000 seriously mentally ill who are in jails and prisons. And we have 3 million people with serious mental illness who are getting zero treatment, nothing, in spite of this expenditure of almost $200 billion. That's the insane consequences. And a lot of my book goes into this in detail. But because this is a NAMI book, a NAMI audience, many of us experience this all the time. Even educated, tenacious, loving parents, educated parents, can't get care for seriously mentally ill loved ones. Families are being torn apart. I don't have to talk about the insane consequences with this group because many of us live with it. I will talk about the second part, how the mental health industry is failing the mentally ill. Now, for me, like many of you, this is not just an academic issue. I have a seriously mentally ill family member. My wife's sister was living in Wisconsin, going to college. She was living with her old world babushka-wearing mother, and the two of them started fighting. And we thought, well, this is just an American teen living with her old world mom who doesn't get it, and if we bring her to live with us aging ex-hippies, everything's going to be fine. We were that stupid. And so we brought her to live with us in New York, and it was totally bizarre. She thought the FBI planted a transmitter in her head. She thought that people across the street were talking about her. At the dinner table, she would spew hours of incomprehensible gibberish that I had heard homeless people doing, but I never heard anyone I loved doing that. And at night, we would hear her in her room arguing with the voices in her head. Now, eventually, we called an ambulance, and they took her to the hospital, and she got in, and I know that sounds odd to a lot of people because calling for help generally doesn't get you in a hospital these days, but back then you could. And they stabilized her, but due to privacy concerns, they couldn't tell us what was wrong with her. So they couldn't tell us what her diagnosis was, what treatment she was on, what prescription she needed, where her rehabilitation program was, or anything. So we couldn't arrange transportation. We couldn't arrange for payment and for medications to be picked up. She had cognitive dysfunction. She couldn't do this on her own. And ultimately, she decompensated, and we went back and forth with this. So that's when I started volunteering with our local NAMI. And I was an advertising executive. I was doing television commercials. I say I had the world's most meaningless job. If I didn't get up, you wouldn't know Wheaties was 10 cents off that day. But I was in advertising, so I started volunteering with the local NAMI, and I decided I'm going to write fact sheets. what are our top calls? We logged our top calls, and I wanted a fact sheet so I could tell people, make sure that at least in follow-up we were giving them accurate information, even if it wasn't as accurate when they called. And the calls were what you'd expect. How do I find the right medication? How do I find a doctor? How do I find housing? How do I do estate planning? But one of the calls that was in our top 10 was, my mentally ill brother, sister, mother, father, son, daughter is in the room, thinks we're poisoning his food, is falling further and further into delusions. What can I do? And the reality was, there was no fact sheet I could write about that. The parents had already tried listening, explaining, empathizing, cajoling, bribing, and trying to help their ill relatives see the need for treatment. They tried calling the mental health department and were turned away. But they were faced with a catch-22. They could not get treatment for their ill relative until after they became danger to self or others. As ludicrous as it sounded, the law, rather than preventing violence, actually required it. I mean, even seatbelt laws prevent dangerous behavior, but for the mentally ill, we couldn't do this. They were also presented with a different catch-22. If someone is well enough to walk into a hospital and say, I have a mental illness and I need treatment, chances are the hospital's going to say, you're not sick enough for us to admit you. The fact that you know you're ill means you're not sick enough to need hospitalization. And that's the kind of general issue I've spent the last 30 years looking into. How do we prevent the most seriously mentally ill from having to suffer, from having to deteriorate, to become homeless, arrested, suicidal, having families fall apart? How can we stop this? And what I came to realize over the years of advocacy was that the mental health industry, the mental health advocates, we were the problem. It wasn't others, we were the problem. And the mental health industry hold over what gets funded is as complete as the financial industry's hold over what gets funded in Washington for the financial industry. Now, before going on, I have to say I am not a mental health advocate. Like most of you, I am a mental illness advocate. 100% of the population can have their mental health improved. They could be made happier. 18% have a diagnosable mental illness, meaning something that's in the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. By the way, of that 18%, a lot of it is minor depression, minor anxiety, minor ADHD. But 4% of the population has a very serious mental illness that inhibits their ability to function. And that is the group that we should be focusing on. Many of them can't think straight. Now, the two main disorders, any disorder that dramatically affects your, limits your ability to function can be a serious mental illness. The two largest are schizophrenia spectrum disorders and severe bipolar disorder. But depression, if it gets to a certain point, can be serious. PTSD, if it gets serious. So there are others, but the two main ones are schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And to put it in California perspective, of the 30 million adults in California, about 1.2 million have serious mental illness. 40% of those, 480,000, receive zero treatment. Now, you can argue that the line is 5% or 6%, or the line between normal and sick may be debatable. But the extremities are pretty clear. And there are some people who are extremely seriously mentally ill. And many of these have something called anosognosia. Because the illness affects their brain, they don't know they're ill. The organ that's charged with regulating their behavior is the one that's not functioning right. And the way I describe it, when you walk down the streets, although I guess here you drive, but in New York, when we walk down the streets and somebody is coming at us screaming, I am the Messiah, it is not because they think they're the Messiah. They're screaming that because they know they're the Messiah. Their illness tells them it is so. And because they know they're the Messiah and know the real problem is everyone doesn't recognize that they're the Messiah, they are not going to get treatment. And this is anosognosia, unawareness. It also affects stroke victims. And, you know, nationally, and I'm going to use some famous cases, not because they're typical, they're atypical, but we all know them. John Hinckley shot President Reagan because he knew the best way to get a date with Jodie Foster was by shooting the president. He knew that. It was a fact to him. Russell Weston shot 2 guards at the U.S. Capitol because he knew there was a ruby red time reversal system in the basement and he wanted access to it. His illness told him it is so. And in California, you had John Zawahiri, who killed 5 in Santa Monica, Elliot Rogers in Isla Vista, Scott Decarai, who shot 8 in Seal Beach, Juan Elgo at Okios University. I mean, there's a whole bunch of them. Now, rarely do the seriously mentally ill become headline-grabbing tragedies, but they nonetheless do become tragedies. Homelessness, vagrancy, getting arrested for dining and dashing, stalking because you think you're married to a celebrity. Tragedies like moms who have to sleep with their doors locked for fear of their mentally ill relative. Siblings whose interests are subsumed to the needs of the ill family member. Walking on eggshells. These are all tragedies as well. So why aren't the seriously ill being treated? The problem nationwide, as well as in California, is that we spend way too much money on mental health and not enough on mental illness. And if there's one thing you take away today, this is my message. We are spending way too much on the highest functioning and not enough on the most seriously ill. The least symptomatic and highest functioning go to the head of the line for services, while the seriously mentally ill go to jails, shelters, prisons, and morgues. Think about it. We used to have a hospital-based system, which by definition served the most seriously ill. Now we have a community-based system that often rejects those who were so sick they would have otherwise been in a hospital. They call them high-needs patients, and we're not set up for high-needs patients. Homelessness, arrest, incarceration, suicide, victimization are the insane consequences that go from allowing the most seriously ill to go untreated. Those generally don't happen from letting less seriously ill go untreated. So the big idea is to focus our existing spending more on the seriously ill, replace mission creep with mission control. We have to spend where the problem is on serious mental illness, not where it's not improving mental wellness and all others. We have to focus on the elephant in the room, getting treatment to the most seriously ill. Now, everyone says we need more money, and maybe we do, but more money rarely goes to the seriously ill, while cutbacks always do. And again, California is the poster child for this. The Prevention and Early Intervention Funds, $350 million, are largely not going to the seriously ill, but hospitals are being cut back. So more money is not the answer unless that money is guaranteed to go to the people who need it most. Now I'm going to spend some time explaining ways that the industry diverts funds from where it can help the seriously mentally ill and applies those to programs that don't help the seriously mentally ill. And let me say, I talk in hyperbole, so I'm talking the industry. And I know there are a lot of people in here, James, he said he's part of the industry, but there are a lot of people within the industry who do care about the seriously mentally ill, work hard with them. There are others who want to, but are caught up in the system that they have no control over. But in general, the industry. How do they divert funds? First of all, they invent new illnesses. When I was growing up, bullying and cyberbullying were not mental illnesses. It was bad behavior. Actually, they didn't have cyberbullying when I grew up, but bullying was bad behavior. Now it's a mental illness and funds are being diverted to it. Trauma is a huge one, especially in California. Trauma is not a mental illness. Everyone loses a parent, a job, experiences a tragedy, gets in an accident. This is part of normality. but the industry has convinced the supervisors that they should now battle trauma, and trauma is defined as whatever anyone considers traumatizing. Now, PTSD is a mental illness, but even PTSD can run from mild to severe. And during World War I and World War II, shell shock, which was the precursor of modern day PTSD, required flashbacks, trembling, vomiting, sweating, uncontrolled defecation, and catatonia. Today, if you have flashbacks and a bad dream, you have PTSD. So we've dumbed down the definition. Prevention is another sideshow that the industry diverts massive funds to. The mental health industry constantly goes in front of politicians and says, you know, if we invest in prevention, if we invest early, we can prevent mental illness and that'll save a lot of money. It sounds so logical. But schizophrenia and bipolar cannot be prevented. And there will be a Nobel Prize to anyone who figures out those. Now, we can prevent people who have mental illness from having it become severe and disabling. And in 2004, when Darrell Steinberg was lobbying for the Mental Health Services Act, he correctly said many times, and I quote, "We can't prevent certain mental illnesses such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, but we can prevent them from becoming severe and disabling." And he was right. However, that's not where the funds are going now. They're going ostensibly to prevent mental illness. That's what prevention, early intervention. They're diverting funds that should go to the seriously ill to kids. They focus on children without mental illness and ignore adults with it. Now, the mental health industry regularly claims that half of all mental illness begins before age 14. And that is absolutely a true claim. They are right about that. But half of it's mild. It's ADHD, being anxious, which used to be a normal part of it. It's now in the diagnostic restless leg syndrome. So half of mental illnesses do begin before age 14, but those are mild mental illnesses. Some are serious, but most are mild mental illness. Another way, the industry overdiagnoses children. Now, bipolar in children is not a made-up disorder, but there's an epidemic of it. But it's not an epidemic because of any new incidents. What happened was in DSM-4, the Diagnostic Manual 4, they made it easier to qualify for that diagnosis. Ditto with ADHD. I think it's like 40% of high school boys are now on ADHD and are taking a medicine. And the editor of DSM-4, Dr. Alan Francis, has done a mea culpa, saying, you know, I am responsible for this. This was wrong for us to define all these as mental illnesses. Suicide. This is another way they're diverting money. Suicide is a tragedy for any family, and I know there was a bunch of instances of this, but it is a suicide. It is a tragedy for any family. But there is zero evidence that suicide campaigns reduce suicide. In fact, there's some evidence, weak evidence, that they increase suicide. But we're focusing on suicide campaigns. Not only that, we're focusing those campaigns on those least likely, not most likely to commit suicide. Again, the industry regularly claims that suicide is the second leading cause of death in kids under 24. And once again, they're making a true claim. However, children under 24 rarely die of anything. That's why it's the second leading cause of death. Now look at what happened. Of the 43,000 suicides, 2015, 5,500 were under age 24, 37,500 of those were over 24. Now look at spending. Due to industry lobbying, Congress spent $54 million on the under 24 and only $2 million on the over 24. Suicide funding is going to where suicide isn't, not where it is. Now, if you want to reduce suicide and you believe things work, and it's hard not to say we're not going to try to reduce it even when the evidence doesn't show it works. Those most likely to commit suicide are those who previously attempted. We have their names. They were probably taken to the ER or the police were called. So if we want to reduce suicide, we don't have to run an ad campaign on television. We can focus on previous attempters. The elderly, suicide is far more likely in those over 55 than under 24. People with schizophrenia and bipolar disorder have an increased rate of suicide. And again, we have many of their names. And if you really want to reduce suicide, the absolute highest incidence is in prisoners. But we're spending suicide on kids under 24 in the schools. By the way, there's also evidence that those in the same age group, under 24, the ones most likely are those who are not in school. It's not college-age kids, it's the dropouts and those who don't go on to college. But our suicide efforts are targeted on the colleges. States are wasting millions of dollars on trying to identify the asymptomatic. There's something called mental health first aid. It teaches the public to identify people who are so asymptomatic that special training is needed. The reality is identification has never been a problem. Every day I get calls from moms and dads who are begging and pleading for treatment for seriously mentally ill loved ones and cannot get it. California could identify all the people with mental illness who need help simply by putting a caseworker outside the hospital, the jail, the shelter, and down in the homeless camp. You don't have to teach the public how to identify the mentally ill. We know where they are. The industry diverts funds away from reducing violence. They claim the mentally ill are no more violent than others, and this has become the regular introduction to any story on violence, any politician who talks about it, and it is true. The 18% with mental illness are no more violent than others, and in fact it's even true the 4% with serious mental illness are no more violent than others. But the 4% with serious mental illness who go untreated are more violent than others. The studies that prove otherwise are of the treated. They are not doing studies of the untreated. The studies are just showing that treatment works, or they're doing studies that eliminate the violent from the studies. They're studies of violence in the community. That means you've excluded those in jails, you've excluded those in prisons, you've excluded those in ERs, you've excluded those in psychiatric hospitals. So it is true, if you exclude the violent mentally ill from studies of the mentally ill, you find they're no more violent than others. And when the people ask, are people with mental illness more violent? I don't think they're thinking about their co-worker in the cubicle or at the crane who's taking Prozac or Zoloft and is doing quite well. I think they're talking about the people in the homeless camps that I went around and saw today. And if we don't admit to violence, we can't reduce it. And it's very important. Look at the reality. I mean, even the only group that believes the mentally ill are not more violent than others is the mental health industry. And even they know it, but it's politically incorrect. The reality is psychiatric units are locked. Cancer units aren't. The mentally ill are no more violent. Why would that be? Psychiatric nurses wear panic buttons. Those in liver units don't. Police are called to go on calls for people with untreated serious mental illness. They're not called for untreated psoriasis. It just doesn't happen like that. Everyone other than the mental illness, other than the industry knows this. The same mental health groups that claim the mentally ill are no more violent do their outreach in pairs for their own safety. They divert attention from violence by focusing on victimization. Another common claim is that the mentally ill are more likely to be victimized than they are to be perpetrators. There's data in my book that shows that may or may not be true, but really it's largely irrelevant. The same treatments that reduce violence reduce victimization. It's the same exact treatment, so what does it matter that one is more or less than the others? And I would posit that it is violence by the minority that tars the majority. No stigma campaign is going to trump people who are seeing headlines about mentally ill mass killers on the rampage. It is violence by the minority that makes the public think less of the nonviolent majority. And let me go to stigma, because stigma is a huge one. The industry has convinced government that stigma is a major barrier to treatment. All studies show, and all moms and dads and siblings know, that stigma is not a major barrier to treatment. The major barriers to treatment are you can't find a program that will treat the person, there's no psychiatrist, you can't afford the treatment, you can't get transportation to the treatment when you're in a rural area. These are far greater impediments to treatment than stigma is. Somebody coined Scales' rule. The role of stigma in inhibiting care is inversely related to severity of illness. So yes, a high-powered executive may not want his coworkers or his boss to know that he's seeing a shrink, but the guy who's eating out of a dumpster is not avoiding doctors because he's afraid what his fellow dumpster divers are going to think of him. This is Mental Health Awareness Month. Mental Health Awareness Month is premised on the idea that the way to reduce stigma is not let the public see the seriously mentally ill. It's to convince the public that the mentally ill are just like you and me and everybody can become a productive member of society. You won't see the homeless psychotic in Mental Illness Awareness Week. Matter of fact, those running the campaign are afraid this will stigmatize the highest functioning if the public gets to see it. So these activities are designed to hide the seriously mentally ill. I don't know how many of you saw the Dr. Phil episode with Shelley Duvall, the actress from The Shining. She has serious mental illness. Dr. Phil had her on. She was going on with delusional thoughts about Robin Williams still being alive, and he was just merely shifting his shape and a whole bunch. And it was wonderful because he let the camera roll, and you heard somebody given these delusional thoughts, and you thought, my God, this woman needs treatment. And you would think the mental health industry, which is always say consumers speaking up for themselves, would have cheered this. Instead, the internet went ballistic, saying that he was exploiting her, and eventually he pulled down the episode. We have to let the public see the horror of serious mental illness. Trying to gain sympathy for the mentally ill by only showing the highest functioning is like trying to gain sympathy for the hungry by only showing the well-fed. You just can't get there from here. The NAMI's, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, and the locals and states are different. They've told the media, don't use the word suffer when reporting on the mentally ill, and yet the mentally ill do suffer. California's Mental Health Services Act has stigma baked into it. Every program has a stigma component. Very few have a treat the seriously mentally ill component. Now let's talk about what helps the mentally ill. So those are all the places they diverted money to. Let's talk about some of the places the industry prevents money from going to that really do help the seriously ill. Hospitals, housing, intensive assertive case management, clubhouses, assisted outpatient treatment called Laura's Law here. Those are some of the programs that help the seriously mentally ill, and on some, not all of those, the industry is on the wrong side. Psychiatric hospitals are very important. Even with a good community services, you need 50 beds per 100,000, which means California's short thousands. They don't have to be long-term beds, but people periodically cycle in, and they got to go back into a hospital. The industry perpetuates the myth that closing hospitals reduces institutionalization, and it's simply not true. It moved institutionalization to jails, and there's a chart in my book where you add up, if I took 1960, how many were in jails? Very few. How many were in hospitals? Very many, and I have those two figures, and I compare it to today. And you'll find that hospitalization plus incarceration in 1960 and today was virtually the same. There's no decrease in institutionalization. It just moved from hospitals to jail. By the way, homelessness accounts for most of the difference between those two numbers. So closing hospitals has not reduced institutionalization. Now, I'm not going to go into it, but the biggest reason hospitals close is because of a federal policy called the IMD exclusion, which prevents Medicaid from reimbursing for state psychiatric hospitals. So because states can't get funds for the state Medicaid funds, the states lock the front door of the hospitals, open the back, and they're trying to empty them. 93% of the state hospitals in California, 93% of the patients in California state hospitals got there only because they went through the criminal justice system. They're unfit to stand trial, being evaluated, they're being conserved, they're not guilty by reason of insanity, things like that. So only 3% of the beds are available. Now turning to the industry, and this happens in California, I don't know about this particular county, but peer respite centers are being billed as an alternative to hospitals. Well, look at the criteria to get in some of the peer respite centers. Many of them, you can't be homeless. You have to be able to manage your own medication. You can't have other medical needs, and you have to volunteer. So many of the seriously mentally ill aren't being helped. The peer respite centers were an alternative to hospitalization. The recruiters would stand in front of the hospitals and divert the ambulances. Instead, they're getting patients by going out and talking to the community. Come in here. Laura's Law. I assume everyone in here knows Laura's Law? Okay, so no.
Know
Laura,
of it, but not, know of it, but not detailed.
Okay, so Laura's Law, it's court-ordered outpatient treatment. Before Laura's Law, the only thing you could do with somebody who was so sick they didn't know they were sick or was becoming dangerous or violent was to put them in inpatient commitment, remove all their rights, 5150 and 5160, remove all their rights, or you could put them in jail. Assisted outpatient treatment, Laura's Law, offers another alternative. If somebody it's for a very small group, and it's important to understand that. It's not even for that 4%. This is for that 4% who have anosognosia, who won't voluntarily comply with treatment, and as a result have a history of homelessness, arrest, violence due to non-compliance with treatment. It allows judges to order them to accept treatment as a condition of living in the community. A mandated services, case management, and whatever else they might need, drug counseling, rehabilitation, employment counseling. And what it allows judges to do is not only order the individual to accept the treatment for 1 year, it's time limited, but also order the mental health system to provide it. So it orders the mental health system to do what they won't do voluntarily, which is serve the most seriously mentally ill. It's available in, I think now it's 47 states. It's not widely used in any, but let me be clear. It is the single most successful program to reduce incarceration, homelessness, hospitalization, and arrest of the mentally ill. I'm going to repeat that. Laura's Law is the single most successful program to reduce incarceration, hospitalization, arrest of the mentally ill. As your handout shows, in Los Angeles, it reduced incarceration 78% and hospitalization 86%. In Nevada County, it reduced homelessness and incarceration over 60% each. No other program has such stellar results. Now, you would think, I just came from Santa Barbara, either yesterday or the day before, their mental health director opposed it, and after they saw the results of a pilot program, totally supports it. There is no study in the last 15 years that doesn't show stellar results from using it. Now, the only thing more effective than Laura's Law is that California's mental health industry's attempt to see it isn't used. Mental health funds are going directly to Disability Rights California and some radical anti-psychiatry consumer groups to fight Laura's Law. And they're spreading what I guess in the nomenclature of the day is called fake news. The mental health industry says Laura's Law allows forced treatment. It doesn't. Going in front of a judge kind of compels people, it coerces them, but there's no real teeth to it. But people go in front of a judge tells you to do something, and most individuals will do it. They say it increases stigma. The research shows that those in AOT have less stigma. They say it violates rights. Courts have said this is an appropriate use of the police powers to prevent dangerous behavior, and parents patriotic to prevent people from hurting themselves. It's courts, not the mental health industry, that decides what civil rights are. They say it restricts freedom. It's far less restrictive than the alternatives, inpatient commitment or hospitalization. They say it's expensive, but by reducing expensive incarceration and inpatient commitment, it cuts the cost of care by 50%. And this is solid research on all this. Now, the county behavioral health directors, and I don't know this county, they are the biggest problem. What they are doing, in my opinion, is inhumane. Mental Health Services Act, which I'll talk about in a bit, but it was basically passed to help the severely mentally ill. The behavioral health directors are telling their supervisors that we can't implement this program unless you give us more money. And they're saying that you have to give us the money to house each patient, to provide the case management, to provide their medications, to provide their rehabilitation, their peer support, whatever. That's ludicrous. Everyone who's eligible for Laura's Law is entitled to Mental Health Services Act funded services. The only incremental cost of Laura's Law is about $2,000 or $5,000 to pay for the court costs, and those can't be reimbursed with Mental Health Services Act funds. But what the behavioral health directors are doing is they are saying, we will treat everyone in the county unless they're so sick they need Laura's Law, and we won't treat those individuals. They're doing the exact opposite of what Laura's Law was intended to do. I would argue, and I'm not a lawyer, that it's a violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act. It's discriminating against people based on their diagnosis. There is specific legislation that's been passed, specific language in Mental Health Services Act, and in your handout, there's a specific regulation that says you can't exclude people from Mental Health Services Act funded programs based on their voluntary or involuntary status. They're running a tab for Laura's Law participants that they're not running for others. Now, the advocates will say, well, if we put somebody in Laura's Law, then we won't have the money to help other people. And I say, fine. The Laura's Law people are the most seriously ill. Those are the exact people this law was intended to help. They specifically, in the preamble to Mental Health Services Act, talk about it being used for programs that reduce homelessness, arrest, incarceration, and suicide, all of which it does. I'm going to turn to the Mental Health Services Act quickly. In 2004, when this passed, I cried. I monitored legislation nationally, and to my knowledge, this was the first bill ever that designated the severely mentally ill, not the mentally ill, not mental health, not mental wellness, the severely ill as being the target population. And they defined it pretty broadly. I used 4%. I think they came up with 6 or 7%, but it was very clear that they were still focused on the most seriously mentally ill. Now, it is very clear that the full service partnership component, which is 80% of the program, is, by the way, this raises $1.5 billion a year now. It is very clear the full service partnership programs are helping many people who have serious mental illness. And I don't want anything to take away with that. It is very clear. It is also very clear that it's not helping many people with serious mental illness. It's not paying for hospitals, and it's only available to those who are well enough to recognize they are sick. So many people are being excluded from full service partnerships. Not only that, but I get reports of problems with it, especially in the area of arranging transportation, but every program has problems, so I'm not going to begrudge them that. But the prevention and early intervention component, which is 20% of the total, that's roughly $350 million a year in California funds, is clearly not serving the seriously ill. Programs to eliminate bad grades, poverty, hunger, bad parenting, angst about sexual identity, prostitution, sex trafficking, crime, unemployment, divorce, truancy have all wrapped themselves in a mental health narrative and had Mental Health Services Act funds diverted to them. Now, none of those are mental illnesses. Yoga, line dancing, family activity nights, creative learning circles, gardens for people of Hmong ancestry, homework clubs, all qualified for Mental Health Services Act funds, even though they have nothing to do with preventing homelessness, arrest, incarceration of the seriously mentally ill, which was the purpose of the Mental Health Services Act. And legislators know this. I mean, I've been screaming it for years, but there were other people in California before me, Rose King, Teresa Pasquini, Kathy Day. So advocates have put out, we put out a report called, after 10 years, called Mental Health Services Act, a 10-year bait and switch. And by the way, if you go to my website, you'll see I have a specific section on California. But it's not just the advocates. The Associated Press exposes. The California State Auditor, not one, but two little Hoover Commission reports, have all concluded that there's no accountability for how the funds are being spent. And yet it goes on, and there's no outrage from Californians. And I gotta say, I'm confused by that. Another thing, Mental Health Services Act funds are required to be used for evidence-based programs. Now, to most people, that means they have to have independent evidence. They improve a meaningful metric like homelessness, arrest, incarceration, or suicide in the target population, the seriously mentally ill. The programs being funded by Mental Health Services Act rarely have any of that. The evidence is rarely independent. It's done by people who run the programs. They measure soft and meaningless metrics, like they'll measure sense of hopefulness, sense of wellness, sense of health, and report a drop in or an increase in any one of those as evidence that the program's successful, even if the other two metrics go down. They're refusing to measure meaningful metrics like rates of homelessness, arrest, suicide, incarceration, and violence. They also use process measures in lieu of progress measures. So you have tons of these referral lines referring people to non-existent services and then reporting that they're a success because more people are calling. That's a process. The number of calls is not the metric. I don't care how many calls. I want to know, did the people get services? They're not measuring that. Now, there's three levels of failure with this program. The biggest one is first of all, they've eliminated the Department of Mental Health, and people know about that, but there is an oversight commission. The so-called Oversight Commission, though, issued a regulation which says we will allow any program to be considered evidence-based as long as it's popular. So as long as everyone's wasting money on it, that counts as being evidence-based. And this is how mental health first aid and some peer support, and I know people are going to disagree with me on that one, but are getting funded, is that they call it practice-based evidence. No research needed, no results. As long triple P parenting is another one. As long as it's popular, it has evidency. They actually fund this Oversight Commission anti-treatment advocacy. They're sending funds directly to Disability Rights California under the guise of preventing stigma, and they're using it to prevent Laura's Law. They game their research. The Steinberg Institute, Darrell Steinberg's Institute, Darrell Steinberg founded the Mental Health Services Act, and now the Oversight Commission is hiring the Steinberg Institute to come out with reports that say the funds are working well. They're hiring UCLA, and I know that's a highly esteemed university, but the fact is they're getting so much oversight money to gin up reports that they are going to give the Oversight Commission the reports they want. So for instance, I used to read the Oversight Commission board minutes every month, and there's like multiple meetings, so it takes a lot of effort. But the Oversight Commission, UCLA was presenting the Oversight Commission with some preliminary reports, and the Oversight Commission in the minutes said, go back and focus on positive outcomes. Or another time they came up with a report that allegedly showed savings, and Sheriff Brown, I think he's Santa Barbara, the only outsider, he said, wait a minute, you put the cost of incarceration as X dollars, and that's ridiculous. You're going to get laughed out of town, because they were trying to show a lot of savings. And so the only thing he could get UCLA to do was to put a footnote indicating there was a problem. They came out with a report that said showing people a movie saved like, $80 million. I forget what the exact statistic was, the exact amount. Showing a movie does not save money. Now I'm going to talk about some of the fixes. How do we fix the system? On the federal level, obviously the biggest thing coming down the pike is what's going to happen with the Affordable Care Act. What are they going to do with it? I don't pretend to have any more information on that than what we've all been reading, that it's going to be a disaster. So I'm just not going to talk about it. There just isn't enough information, and you know as much as me about that. There is something else going on, though. There is a federal bureaucracy called the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, which is responsible for developing the nation's mental health policy. And basically, they've made sure that the policy is to not focus on the most seriously mentally ill. They're funding pop psychology, neuro-nonsense, anti-psychiatry. They've totally abandoned treatment of the most seriously ill. For the last 3 years, I've been involved in something called the Helping Families in Mental Health Crisis Act. It was eventually incorporated in the 21st Century Cures Act. One of the things that bill did, in addition, by the way, to funds for AOT, for Laura's office, was it created a new position, an Assistant Secretary of Mental Health. So it's raising the visibility and the importance of mental health to a higher level of government and to making it a sub-cabinet position. And Donald Trump appointed somebody, made a brilliant appointment. Now I know using Trump and brilliant as someone to the left of Bernie does offend me as well. But there was a critic within SAMHSA who left and wrote a scathing criticism of SAMHSA. And it could have been a career ender for her. What other government agency is going to hire somebody who then blew the whistle when she left? And Trump reached out and is vetting her now for the position. So one of the things you can do, her name is Eleanor McCants-Katz, is you can write Senators Feinstein and Harris to say that this would be a good appointment. Now before I leave Trump, let me say something. I am to the left of Bernie, but conservatives, police, sheriffs, district attorneys, Republicans are much better on this issue than my fellow Democrats. They are appalled by waste of money, which a lot of the mental health services, a lot of mental health funding is. They do want safer streets, fewer homeless on the streets, fewer incarcerated. The Democrats, my fellow Democrats, are not willing to admit unpleasant truths, that not everyone recovers. We're supposed to believe everyone recovers. They don't believe that there's people who can't self-direct their own care. They won't believe the unpleasant truth that we do need hospitalization, that involuntary outpatient treatment is better than arrest and incarceration, and they won't believe, Democrats, that when the seriously mentally ill go untreated, yes, they are more violent than others. So I would urge everyone to work closely with conservatives, take this debate outside the mental health industry. When this debate goes outside the mental health industry, we win. The public wants fewer homeless, they want fewer in jail, they want safer streets, they don't want to see the headlines, and they are willing to do this. All the controversy about the issues that I'm talking about exists solely with a tempest in a teapot within the mental health industry. So whenever there is an act of violence, the mental health industry is out there saying, oh, the mentally ill are not more violent, and I'm out there saying, the seriously mentally ill who go untreated are more violent than others, so our policy should be to get treatment to the seriously mentally ill. I would urge, someone asked me yesterday a question, which I thought was good, and said, well, DJ, you identified so many problems, what should we work on? I would work on whatever you have compassion for fixing, but I would go deep. We all talk to each other and we say, you know, we need a more equitable system, we need parity, we need this, we need that. Pick an issue, become the subject matter expert on that. You can read the legislation that's coming through. You don't have to be a lawyer. I am not a lawyer, and I can read the legislation. Sometimes on the federal level it's tough, but it's not that hard on the state level. Read the regulations that are coming out of the Mental Health Services Accountability and Oversight Commission. Another level of failed oversight is this commission. And here's the problem with the commission. The Oversight Commission is all industry.